Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that Washington's written response to Russia's security demands sets out a diplomatic path forward if Moscow were to approach it seriously in an effort to de-escalate tensions in Ukraine.
The document we've delivered includes concerns of the United States and our allies and partners about Russia's actions that undermine security, a principled and pragmatic evaluation of the concerns that Russia has raised, and our own proposals for areas where we may be able to find common ground.
While the letter addresses some of Moscow's top concerns, the U.S. remains firm on rejecting Putin's central demand to commit to never admitting Ukraine to the alliance. Earlier this week, Biden threatened Putin with personal sanctions against if he directs Russian forces to invade Ukraine.
But here in the U.S., Western media has blown up the tensions and even questioned if the situation could escalate to World War III. But according to the World News on Twitter, Ukrainian leaders are telling their citizens that while the threat of a Russian invasion is real, the threat is not imminent. Veteran, host of the Drinkin Bros podcast and the American Party podcast, Dan Hollaway writes in Newsweek that the situation in Ukraine is exposing the real divide in the GOP, and he lays out how both parties have bloodied their hands over useless wars throughout history. He joins us now, and we're also joined by Mohamed, Younis, editor-in-chief of Gallup News. Welcome to you both. So let's start with you, Dan. Why don't you lay out the argument that you made in Newsweek? You argued that real conservatives oppose war. Talk us through the argument.
Well, sure. I mean, the idea that we would extend ourselves beyond our borders to do something to protect our citizenry is one that people over the last 25 years or so have struggled with quite a bit, I would say, right? The history of war in the 20th century was dominated by the Democratic Party, and the country had to be dragged kicking and screaming into World War I. The Monroe Doctrine was still around. Obviously, I'm sure your viewers are aware of what that is. Conservatism is about minding your own business, right? And it doesn't seem like that's something that we're really into lately. Bush ran on this platform of, George W. Bush ran on this platform of not being a nation builder, the same way that his predecessor, Clinton, Democrat, obviously, was. And obviously that turned around after 9/11, but it turned around in a bunch of unreasonable and unnecessary ways, and it's carried forward. And now it seems like the same thing that's happening with debt in America. Conservatives are supposed to, watch the till, make sure everything is going well, make sure we're saving and so on and so forth. But over the last 20 years, they've presided over the largest expansion of the federal government history, contributed just as much, if not more, to the national debt. And in both regards, both keeping our military aimed at its actual purpose and managing our debt and economics in general, Republicans have failed at being conservative. And I think that's the real fight that's going on the conservative side, not between Trump and the establishment.
So how do you think this issue would be received by the American people of, becoming more involved in Ukraine? Because I think there's tremendous fatigue given Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. But then again, the media is kind of more hawkish, I sometimes think, than the American people, and they punished Biden or made sure he was punished for the withdrawal. So how do you think Americans are feeling about foreign policy interventionism at this point?
We know from our trends that foreign policy interventionism continues to be a low desire for the American public. The Iraq War ended up as a very unpopular war after being a very popular bipartisan project. The Afghanistan war did the same, but less dramatically. We know, however, that perceptions, or in addition to that, military preparedness, American satisfaction with the nation's military preparedness dropped 20 points in the past 2 years. It was a big drop this year, probably as a reaction to that Afghanistan withdrawal. That being said, 8 in 10 Americans support NATO being maintained. 6 in 10 Americans, nearly 7 in 10, say that it's very important to defend our allies. Of course, Ukraine isn't a treaty ally of the United States, but there are challenges that President Biden faces, even in perceptions of his own leadership, that's different than the previous presidents. But I think it's important to keep in mind a lot of what your previous guest mentioned is a lot of the reason why we see a historic high in people identifying as independents. The partisanship failures on, I think, both parties when it comes to foreign policy and the wars have been pretty consistent and clear. There hasn't been too much of a difference. That being said, though, President Biden's perception as a decisive leader, most Americans, actually 63%, say that trait doesn't really apply to his leadership. Trump was at 54, Obama was at 56, George W. Bush was at 63, which, again, we should keep in mind. That doesn't mean you're going to create great policies. But the perception that Biden is a decisive leader is a weak point for him. Most Americans see him as likable and intelligent, but not being very decisive.
Yeah, Dan, I think the Afghanistan experience has made people more wary of maybe not the military itself, but the generals, military leadership, the military advisors within the government who told, Obama wanted to get out. And they kind of convinced him to stay and said, no, things are getting better. And then that Trump, the exact same situation, and he's convinced to stay. But I believe the only reason Biden got out is because he was there when they told Obama that, no, don't get out. We're going to fix everything. No worries. So do you think they've the people advising our political figures suck as well, but the people advising them, they've kind of sucked too.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a sycophant brigade, more or less. There's a lot of people don't know this, but once you become a general officer, the only way to get promoted is through Congress, right? Like you have to have the blessing of somebody in the Armed Forces committees to be able to get those other billets. And what does that breed? Obviously, if you have to say certain things the right way to achieve certain things, that's certainly not a meritocracy. To Biden's competency, yeah, you're absolutely right that it's not only is it chilled among the American people, but you have to assume our allies aren't too thrilled about how he left that situation and how he dealt with things afterwards. And let's not forget this. We're talking about Ukraine here, right? And I hate to bring it up again since we're post-election, but there was this issue of his son in Ukraine and all of this madness that we now know to be true. That will get you blocked on Twitter, but it is reality, and no one seems to be talking about that right now. It's very bizarre to me that we're not discussing that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. You also bring up in your op-ed that, we tend to think today of Republicans as warmongers and Democrats as the peaceful party, but actually it's Democrats who are currently bringing forth a massive Ukraine defense bill. The Democrats in the House are planning to expedite legislation that would dramatically increase U.S. security assistance to Ukraine and lay the groundwork for new sanctions on Russia. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is looking to push the bill straight to the House floor to set up a vote possibly next week. The legislation would send $500 million from the Foreign Military Financing Program to Ukraine for 2022, and that amount would have made Ukraine the third largest recipient of funding from the State Department's FMF account in 2020, surpassed only by $3.3 billion that we give to Israel and $1.3 billion that we give to Egypt. So Mohamed, can you talk to us about how the American people view this kind of spending? Is it popular? Is it something that there's support for among the American people?
It really depends on the conflict and the situation. One thing I'll tell you is Americans tend to overestimate the amount of aid America gives overseas. Americans are certainly not in favor of promoting democracies across the world, but the role that America plays in the world is very important to a majority of Americans. And right now, 57% of Americans are dissatisfied with the role that the U.S. is playing in the world. Look, it's really easy for us to kind of nitpick this moment in time and overstate the lessons hopefully learned from Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's go back to 2015. When the war in Ukraine was really exploding, we asked Americans about the threats to the U.S. Between Russia, the nature of the threat to the U.S. in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And 89% of Americans described it as either a critical threat or an important threat to the United States. So if this thing really takes off, it's important to kind of learn the lessons of where the public was the last time this war had really escalated. I think another major difference here is that no one is proposing large-scale U.S. soldier deployment to Ukraine at this point. I think another factor here, which is really interesting than 2015, is the beginnings of a plan to solve the energy component of this conflict. We saw that Qatar and the U.S. now are openly talking about finding ways to alleviate the energy crunch on Europe if this conflict were to take over, and if the Nord Stream pipeline were to actually be sidetracked. So it's really easy to kind of overstate what we just horribly saw, an end of failure as an end to a war in Afghanistan. I think most Americans would describe it that way. But at the same time, we should keep in mind what happened last time. The last thing I'd say is when we ask Ukrainians about some of this, I think it's important for American policymakers to keep in mind that only 37% of Ukrainians approve of U.S. leadership. And that rate hasn't really changed through the past 3 presidents. So at 37% approval and 12% approval for Russia's leadership, Ukraine is kind of stuck in the middle. And I think a big challenge for Secretary Blinken is how to increase that 37% and bring more of that population to the U.S. side, if that's the objective.
You know, Dan, I suspect the administration is so kind of keen to be involved in the Ukraine question because, you know, the idea of Russia as our main enemy is something the Democratic Party has had increasing, and the mainstream media increasing kind of need to buy into. That's what they've, you know, told the voters and the viewers is this main conflict ever since the kind of like great switch on Russia, where like overnight, because Hillary Clinton doesn't like Vladimir Putin and Trump kind of does, the Republicans become the pro-Russia party and the Democrats become the anti-Russia party. Like it was astonishing. It happened in the course of a single day. Everyone just reversed what they thought about the issue for totally just like political tribal reasons. But that I think that effect does drive how Biden feels he has to view these issues.
For sure, yeah. I mean, you got to imagine that Mitt Romney's punching air right now, right? He can't be happy that he got roasted about as hard as I've ever seen a political candidate get roasted for something, for saying that Russia was our #1 geopolitical enemy. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of pressure on Biden. He wants to take the focus off. I mean, he's not done well in any regard so far. So obviously he wants to take the pressure off. And, you know, Russia's an easy enemy, I guess, but this to your other guests, if you look at if you keep an eye on history and how things played out before, is that different from the containment strategy at the front end of the Cold War that did nothing for us except for result in the Bay of Pigs, us dropping all sorts of nonsense on South America, Central America, and stuff like that, and being involved in micro wars all over the place. It feels like mission creep to me. Like being a soldier, I understand we go to some place with a very specific goal in mind, and then all of a sudden we're doing something entirely different, and all of a sudden 60,000 Americans are dead in Vietnam, right? I mean, this isn't something that I think we should take very lightly. I understand that Americans want to have a positive influence on the world, and that's a very good thing to do. But sometimes, you have to let people work out their own madness, especially when the poll numbers are so close on Russian and U.S. involvement there.
Yeah. Well, we got to leave it there. Dan and Mohamed, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, sir.
We'll have more Rising after this.